The end of World War II was supposed to be a moment of peace, justice, and rebuilding. But for many Germans, soldiers, civilians, and even children, May 1945 marked the beginning of a new nightmare. Across Central and Eastern Europe, in towns and forests, in prisons and open fields, thousands of Germans were hunted down, tortured, and executed in acts of vengeance too gruesome for most history books. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a brutal wave of retribution unleashed by Allied soldiers, resistance fighters, and civilians, many of whom had suffered unimaginable horrors themselves under Nazi occupation. This is not a defense of the Nazi regime. Far from it. But buried beneath the ruins of the Third Reich lies another story, of revenge turned to massacre, of justice twisted by rage. In May 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered, ending 6 years of war in Europe. Cities were in ruins, millions were dead, and soldiers laid down their weapons. For the Allies, it was a hard-won victory, but the peace that followed wasn't calm. It was chaotic. All across the continent, borders shifted, governments collapsed, and displaced people flooded the roads. In many regions, especially in Eastern Europe, the end of the war brought a power vacuum where violence could erupt unchecked. And in that unstable moment, some took justice into their own hands, with deadly consequences for many Germans. After years of Nazi occupation, the rage in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia was intense. Locals had suffered through massacres, forced labor, and genocide. So when the Nazis fell, many wanted revenge. Not trials, not forgiveness, but blood. And they found it. German soldiers who surrendered were sometimes executed on the spot. Ethnic Germans, even those not involved in the war, were beaten, jailed, or killed. It wasn't just revenge. It was rage, grief, and hatred exploding after years of suffering. This was the environment in which the massacres of 1945 took place. Dachau, liberation, reprisals. On April 29, 1945, American troops liberated the Dachau concentration camp in southern Germany. What they found shocked them. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, piles of dead bodies, and the full horror of Nazi brutality on display. The U.S. soldiers were furious, and many snapped. Within hours, they began executing captured SS guards. Some were shot in groups against walls. Others were killed by prisoners who had just been freed. Reports vary, but it's believed that between 35 and 50 SS men were killed in revenge. While some officers tried to restore order, others looked away. In the chaos, the line between justice and revenge vanished. The massacre at Dachau showed just how raw and uncontrollable the rage was, even among disciplined Allied forces. Niederkine Massacre. In May 1945, in the small village of Niederkine, near Bautzen, Soviet soldiers captured around 200 members of the German Volkssturm, a civilian militia made mostly of old men and teenage boys. After one of their commanders was killed, Soviet troops reacted with terrifying violence. They herded the prisoners into a barn and set it on fire, burning them alive. The massacre was not ordered officially. It was spontaneous, driven by anger and grief. But no one was punished. Events like Niederkine were rarely recorded in Soviet documents, and survivors were often too afraid to speak. This case shows how easily war's end could turn into mass murder, especially when revenge replaced rules. Jungholzhausen Massacre. As American troops pushed into southern Germany in April 1945, they encountered fierce last-stand resistance from German forces. In the village of Jungholzhausen, several German soldiers surrendered after a brief firefight. What happened next remains controversial. Instead of taking them as prisoners of war, U.S. troops lined up at least 13 and possibly as many as 50 unarmed German soldiers and executed them. Eyewitnesses described a grim scene. The prisoners were marched into a field, told to kneel, and shot. These killings violated military law, but they were covered up for decades. Only in the 1990s did historians start to uncover what had really happened. Jungholzhausen shows that even armies fighting for freedom are capable of crossing dark moral lines. Sudeten German killings. In Czechoslovakia, anger toward ethnic Germans, many of whom had supported Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland, boiled over after the war. In May 1945, in towns like Zátek and Postolopty, Czech partisans and local officials carried out mass executions of German civilians. Most of the victims were not Nazis or soldiers. They were ordinary people. Farmers, factory workers, even teenagers. Eyewitnesses described how Germans were rounded up, forced to dig their own graves, and shot. Others were beaten to death or thrown into mass graves while still alive. It's estimated that over 2,000 people were killed in just a few days. The violence was brutal and chaotic, but also fueled by years of oppression under Nazi occupation. For decades, this massacre was silenced. Speaking out about it was dangerous in post-war Czechoslovakia, where the official story painted all Germans as villains. Only after the fall of communism did researchers and survivors begin telling the truth. The Sudeten German killings remain one of the darkest and least acknowledged episodes of post-war revenge in Europe. Kochevsky Rog mass killings. After Germany's surrender, thousands of German and Slovene collaborators fled into Austria, hoping to surrender to British forces. But many were handed over to the Yugoslav partisans, led by communist leader Josip Broz Tito, in the forests of Kochevsky Rog, Slovenia. What followed was a chilling and systematic execution of tens of thousands. The victims were marched into the woods, lined up at sinkholes or mine shafts, and shot, sometimes bound in groups and pushed in alive. Some were beaten unconscious before being thrown in. Entire groups vanished overnight. The exact number is still debated, but some estimates go as high as 30,000 victims, including ethnic Germans, Slovenes, Croats, and others accused of collaborating with the Nazis. There were no trials, no evidence presented, only accusations and death. The Yugoslav government kept these crimes hidden for decades, and only in recent years have mass graves been uncovered. The Kochevsky Rog massacres stand as a haunting example of how political revenge can lead to industrial-scale murder even after the war is officially over. War leaves scars, not only on bodies and cities, but deep in people's minds. By 1945, millions across Europe had lost family members, homes, and entire communities to the violence of the Nazi regime. So when Germany fell, many weren't looking for peace. They wanted revenge, but the line between revenge and justice quickly vanished. In many of the cases we've discussed, the killings were not part of official orders. They were emotional explosions, acts of raw fury. Soviet soldiers, for example, had seen their families slaughtered and villages burned by the Germans. For them, killing German prisoners wasn't just payback, it felt personal. For Czechs and Yugoslavs, it was a way to punish not just Nazis, but anyone who had benefited from their rule. Legally, most of these massacres were war crimes. Prisoners of war are supposed to be protected under the Geneva Conventions. Civilians, especially women, children, and the elderly, should never be harmed. But in the chaos of 1945, those rules were often ignored. There were no trials, no justice systems in place, just anger, weapons, and silence. And after the war, most of these acts were hidden or denied. Governments didn't want to tarnish the image of their victorious armies or resistance movements. In some places, speaking about these events was dangerous. This silence allowed the cycle of violence to stay buried for decades. What we see in these stories is a harsh truth. Even the victims of terrible crimes can become perpetrators when law and order break down. For decades after 1945, the massacres of Germans were rarely mentioned in history books or public discussions. The focus remained on Nazi atrocities, which were immense and rightly condemned. But the brutal acts committed against Germans at the end of the war were often ignored, denied, or even justified as understandable revenge. In countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, these events became politically sensitive. Speaking out about them could lead to punishment, especially during the communist era. Many survivors kept silent out of fear or shame. Families buried their stories along with the dead. Only after the fall of communism in the 1990s did serious research begin to uncover the full truth. Mass graves were found. Witnesses came forward. Memorials were quietly built. Some governments have since acknowledged these crimes, but full justice has rarely followed. Culturally, the massacres are still being processed. Films, documentaries, and books have started to explore these dark chapters. In some towns, debates continue about whether to honor the victims or leave the past buried. These events remind us that the end of war doesn't always bring peace, and that without justice, wounds can last for generations. The brutal massacres against Germans in 1945 challenge the simple story of good versus evil. While the Nazi regime committed horrific crimes, what happened to many Germans after the war reveals a darker truth about human nature. When justice systems collapse and emotions take over, even victims can become killers. These events aren't meant to excuse anyone, but they do demand reflection. What happens when justice turns into revenge? When pain becomes permission for cruelty? And if we forget these lessons, are we doomed to repeat them?